Dust swirled in the biting wind, whipping across the barren plains and stinging Alara's raw, chapped skin. It tasted of grit and despair, a flavor she had become intimately familiar with since the wagon broke down a week ago, miles from the nearest sign of civilization. Now civilization had found her, or rather, its rough approximation in the form of Sheriff Brant and his 2 deputies, their faces hard and unforgiving beneath the brims of their hats. They'd found her huddled beneath the broken wagon, scavenging for anything salvageable, anything to trade for passage or repair. But Brant saw only a woman alone, vulnerable, easy prey. He spoke of vagrancy laws, of suspicious circumstances, his eyes lingering on the few coins she'd managed to keep hidden. The truth was simpler. He wanted what little she had left, and the power to take it. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the exhaustion that had been her constant companion. She hadn't the strength to fight, not truly. Her resistance was a low murmur of protest, a shake of the head that was easily dismissed. Brant's hand clamped around her arm, his grip like iron, the calluses rough against her skin. "Ain't got no business bein' out here alone, girl," he growled, pulling her upright. "Causes folks to talk. Suspicion ain't something I take kindly to." She stumbled, her worn boots slipping on the loose earth. "I meant no harm, Sheriff. My wagon, it broke. I'm just trying to make my way to." She trailed off, the destination a fading dream. Hope had dwindled with her supplies, leaving only the stark reality of her predicament. Brant laughed, a harsh, dry sound like stones grinding together. "Make your way, eh? Looks like you're making your way right into my jailhouse." The deputies flanked her, silent, their gazes flat and impersonal. They mounted their horses, and Brant forced her to walk ahead of them, the dust kicked up by their mounts coating her threadbare clothes. Each step was an agony, not just physically, but the crushing weight of finality descending upon her. The small, dusty town emerged on the horizon, a collection of weathered wooden buildings that seemed to crouch against the relentless wind. It offered no warmth, no sanctuary, only the promise of further hardship. As they neared the jailhouse, a few faces peered from windows, quickly disappearing as if her presence were an unwelcome stain. Shame burned in her cheeks, hot despite the cold air. She was being paraded, a public spectacle of her misfortune, orchestrated by a man who thrived on the power it gave him. The jailhouse was a squat, solid structure, smelling of stale sweat, old wood, and something acrid she couldn't place. Brant shoved her through the heavy door, the sound echoing in the small, dim space. A single barred door stood open, revealing the sparse, grim interior of a cell. "Get in," Brant ordered, his voice low but carrying an undeniable threat. Alara hesitated, her eyes fixed on the cold, hard floor of the cell. It represented the complete loss of her freedom, the end of the road. Tears welled, blurring her vision, but she fought them back. Crying wouldn't help. It would only show weakness, and weakness was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not here, not now. With trembling legs, she stepped across the threshold. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind her with a final, resounding clang that vibrated through her bones. The sound was the death knell of her immediate hopes, a stark declaration of her imprisonment. Brant's face appeared outside the bars, his eyes cold and triumphant. "You'll stay here until I figure out what to do with you. Don't get any ideas." He lingered for a moment, savoring his power, before turning and walking away, his spurs jingling on the wooden floorboards. The sound faded, leaving Alara alone in the suffocating silence of the cell, the weight of the world pressing down on her. The dust outside settled, but the grit in her soul remained, sharp and painful. Her isolation felt absolute, the bars a physical manifestation of the despair that had settled deep within her. She sank onto the narrow cot, the thin mattress offering little comfort, the rough wool blanket doing little to ward off the chill that seeped from the stone walls. Darkness seemed to gather in the corners, deepening her sense of dread. She was trapped, at the mercy of a cruel man in a forgotten corner of the world, with nothing left but the tattered clothes on her back and a secret tucked away that she prayed would never see the light of day. The cold deepened, settling into her bones, mirroring the icy grip of fear around her heart. The cell was a cage of cold stone and iron, a place where hope withered and died a slow, lingering death. Alara huddled on the cot, pulling the thin blanket tight around her shoulders, though it offered little warmth against the pervasive chill. The air smelled damp and musty, a scent that clung to her clothes and hair, a constant reminder of her confinement. Across the narrow space, another figure occupied the opposite cot. He was a man of few words, introduced to her only by a gruff grunt from Brant as Silas. He seemed carved from the same harsh landscape outside, weathered and silent, his gaze distant. He hadn't spoken to her, hadn't acknowledged her arrival beyond a brief, unreadable look. His presence was neither comfort nor threat, simply another fixture of this desolate place. Time stretched, marked only by the shifting patterns of weak light filtering through the high, barred window. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, a dull ache that added to the misery. Every creak of the floorboards outside the cell door sent a jolt of fear through her. Was it Brant returning? What would he want? She knew his type. Men like him enjoyed wielding their authority, especially over those who couldn't fight back. The silence of the jail was broken only by the occasional shuffle of feet or a distant, indistinguishable sound from the town. Alara closed her eyes, trying to conjure images of a different life, of warmth and safety. But the stark reality of the present was too potent, crushing the fragile memories. Suddenly, the outer door of the jail creaked open, followed by the sound of heavy boots. Alara's eyes snapped open, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was Brant, accompanied by one of his deputies, a younger man named Jed with a nervous twitch in his eye. Brant stood before her cell door, his expression one of casual cruelty. "Decided it's time we had a proper look at you, girl," he said, his voice rough. "See what you're really carrying." He unlocked the cell door, the mechanism groaning in protest. Alara tensed, shrinking back against the wall. Silas remained on his cot, watching them with his same impassive gaze, though a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. "Stand up," Brant ordered. When she hesitated, Jed stepped inside the cell and roughly pulled her to her feet. His touch was cold and impersonal, a violation. "Search her," Brant instructed Jed. Alara felt a wave of nausea. Being searched by this man under Brant's leering gaze felt like the ultimate humiliation. Jed began, his movements clumsy but thorough. He patted down her pockets, ran his hands over her clothes, searching for weapons, money, anything of value. His hand brushed against the inner pocket sewn into the lining of her worn coat, a secret place she had prepared for just such a need. Her breath hitched. She had hoped never to use it, never to rely on the dangerous secret it held. Jed's fingers found the outline of the object within the pocket. "Something here, Sheriff," he mumbled, fumbling with the stitches. Alara felt a prickle of icy dread spread across her scalp. It was happening. The secret was about to be exposed. She squeezed her eyes shut for a brief second, a silent prayer against the inevitable. Jed managed to tear the stitching and pulled out a small oilskin-wrapped packet. It was flat, rectangular, sealed tight against the elements. Brant's eyes narrowed, interest replacing the casual cruelty. Well, what have we here?" He took the packet from Jed, his fingers surprisingly delicate as he unwrapped the oilskin. Inside was not money, nor a weapon, but a single folded piece of thick, cream-colored paper. It looked out of place in this rough, dusty jail, elegant and foreign. Brant unfolded it slowly. It was not a letter in the conventional sense, but more of a formal document, handwritten in a precise, almost artistic script. There was no address, no greeting, just a block of text and a large, elaborate seal pressed into the paper at the bottom. As Brant's eyes scanned the contents, a profound change came over his face. The rough confidence drained away, replaced by something Alara had never seen in him before. Confusion, then disbelief, and finally, a dawning horror that painted his face ashen. Jed watched his sheriff, perplexed by the sudden shift in demeanor. Silas, from his cot, straightened almost imperceptibly, his passive expression sharpening with unexpected attention. The paper rustled faintly as Brant's hand began to tremble. Brant's breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound in the sudden silence of the jailhouse. His eyes, fixed on the paper, widened incrementally, reflecting not just surprise, but a profound, bone-deep terror. The color drained from his face, leaving it pasty and damp with a cold sweat that seemed to spring forth instantly. Jed, standing beside him, noticed the change and shifted uneasily, his nervous twitch accelerating. "Sheriff?" he prompted, his voice hesitant. Brant didn't respond, his gaze locked on the formal script and the heavy, unmistakable seal at the bottom of the page. His hands, moments ago rough with handling Alara, now held the paper with extreme care, as if it were fragile porcelain or something infinitely more dangerous. His knuckles turned white. The document itself was simple, concise, but the name it bore, the authority it represented, was evidently something that resonated through Brant's very being, striking a chord of abject fear. Alara watched him, her own fear momentarily forgotten in the face of his. She had expected anger, perhaps mockery, but this was different. This was the reaction of a predator who had suddenly found himself in the presence of something far larger, far more deadly, than he could comprehend. A shiver started at Brant's shoulders, not from cold, but from a visceral dread that seemed to emanate from him, infecting the very air in the small jail. It wasn't just his hands that trembled now. A tremor ran through his entire body. Jed took a step back, his eyes darting between the paper and his boss, his own face pale. He seemed to catch the contagion of fear, a subtle shaking beginning in his own limbs. Silas, across the cell, remained still, but his eyes, usually distant, were now sharp and focused on Brant. Even from his position, he must have sensed the seismic shift in the room, the tangible presence of dread that had arrived with the piece of paper. He said nothing, but his stillness was potent, watchful. Brant swallowed hard, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. He reread a line, then another, as if needing to confirm what his eyes told him was true. The paper didn't contain threats from Alara. It contained authority over Brant, or perhaps revealed Alara's connection to an authority that made Brant's petty reign absolute insignificance. The seal was the key, a symbol of power that resonated in this world like a death knell. He lowered the paper slowly, his eyes finally lifting to meet Alara's. The cruel triumph was gone, replaced by a bewildered, terrified appraisal. She was no longer a simple vagrant to be exploited, but a carrier, a representative, perhaps even an extension of the terrifying entity named on the page. His mouth opened, but no words came out for a moment. Then, a strangled whisper. You carry this." Alara met his gaze steadily. She didn't need to speak. The silent answer was in her eyes, in the quiet dignity that had replaced her earlier fear. She knew the power of that paper had kept it hidden as a last resort, a terrible protection. It wasn't a shield against bandits or starvation, but against men like Brant, men who thought themselves kings of their small domains. The fear gripping Brant was palpable. It was the fear of consequences, of retribution from a source that operated outside the flimsy boundaries of his law, a force that could erase him with less effort than he had used to lock her away. He looked down at the paper again, his hands still shaking. Jed watched, his face a mask of confusion and alarm. The shivering intensified, spreading from Brant to Jed, a silent acknowledgement of the immense, unseen power that had just entered their jail. The dusty air felt suddenly cold, thin. Brant folded the paper with deliberate, shaky movements, rewrapping it in the oilskin. He didn't hand it back to Alara. He clutched it, his knuckles white, as if the paper itself might bite. His eyes darted around the small space, seeing bars and stone walls not as a cage for prisoners, but potentially for himself. The corrupt sheriff, seconds ago puffing with self-importance, was now a quivering mess, undone by a single piece of paper. The hierarchy of power had been abruptly, violently redefined. The heavy silence in the jail stretched, thick with Brant's palpable terror. He stood rooted to the spot, the oilskin packet clutched in his trembling hand, his eyes darting nervously towards the high window, then back to Alara. The swagger was gone, replaced by a pathetic, shaking vulnerability. Jed, the deputy, mirrored his fear, his face pale and his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Silas, from his cot, watched the scene unfold, a flicker of grim understanding in his eyes. He had seen men like Brant before, puffed up with local power, only to crumble when faced with something truly significant, truly terrifying. The letter, whatever it said, whoever it was from, had stripped Brant bare. "Get out!" Brant rasped to Jed, his voice strained. Jed hesitated, looking uncertainly at Alara still standing in the cell. "Now!" Brant barked, a flicker of his old authority trying to resurface, but it was thin, brittle, overlaid with dread. Jed scrambled back out of the cell, his movements clumsy with haste. Brant followed, closing the cell door, but this time the clang felt different, less like an assertion of power and more like a desperate attempt to contain something dangerous, to put bars between himself and the implications of the letter. He didn't lock the door. He simply closed it, leaned his forehead against the cool steel for a moment, breathing heavily. When he turned, his eyes avoided Alara's directly. He looked at the floor, at the wall, anywhere but at the woman who had unknowingly or knowingly brought such dread into his life. He cleared his throat, the sound dry and rough. "Look," he began, his voice low, entirely lacking its former arrogance. This is a misunderstanding." Alara said nothing, her gaze steady. She felt a strange calm descend upon her. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath her skin, but it was no longer the crushing despair of helplessness. It was the quiet tension of someone who had discovered they held a powerful, albeit dangerous, card. "That paper," Brant continued, gesturing vaguely with the packet. "It changes things." Understatement hung heavy in the air. Changed everything. He didn't apologize. Men like Brant rarely did. Instead, he fumbled for a way out, a way to erase the last hour, to pretend he hadn't unjustly arrested her, hadn't threatened her, hadn't discovered the terrifying secret she carried. He still hadn't given her the letter back. He seemed unable to part with it, as if holding it offered some tenuous control over the situation, or perhaps he was simply too terrified to let it out of his sight. You can't stay here," he muttered, more to himself than to her. The jail was no longer a safe place for him with her in it. He had poked something he shouldn't have. Silas watched, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. He understood. He saw the power shift, the bully cowed by a name, a seal. Brant paced a few steps, wringing his hands, the oilskin packet still clutched tight. The shivering hadn't entirely stopped. A nervous tremor still ran through him. He cast a glance back at Alara in the cell, a look of desperate calculation in his eyes. He needed her gone, quietly, without drawing attention. I'll arrange for you to leave," he said finally, the words forced out. "Tomorrow. First light. I'll see you have passage." He couldn't even bring himself to say her name. She was just you, the terrifying problem. He didn't offer food, water, or the blanket he'd ignored before. He just wanted her gone. He backed away from the cell door, still clutching the paper. "Tomorrow," he repeated, his voice tight. Then, with another shaky breath, he turned and hurried towards the outer door, Jed jumping out of his way. The door closed behind them, much more softly this time. Silence returned to the jail, but it was a different silence than before. The air no longer felt heavy with despair, but with a tense anticipation, a new, fragile kind of hope born from terror. Alara looked at Silas. His gaze met hers, and for the first time, he nodded slowly, a gesture of acknowledgement, of shared understanding. He had witnessed the shift the moment the hunter became the hunted. Alara sank back onto the cot, the thin blanket now feeling slightly warmer. She was still in the cell, still a prisoner of sorts, but her status had irrevocably changed. The letter, the dangerous secret, had not failed her. It had stripped away the false authority of her captor, revealing his true vulnerability. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or the future implications of using such a drastic measure. But she knew she was no longer powerless. The world outside the jail remained harsh, the path ahead uncertain. But she had faced down a bully with nothing but a piece of paper and the weight of the name it carried. Resilience, she knew now, wasn't just enduring. It was understanding the hidden strengths you possessed, even when you were locked in a cage. The dust settled outside, and in the quiet confines of the jail, a seed of fierce, quiet hope began to take root. Her journey wasn't over. It had merely changed direction, marked by the shiver of a corrupt man.